Welcome back to World News and Prophecy. In our last class, we got through Daniel chapter 7 in terms of the text. I want to go back into Daniel 7 again, however, and go through the 10 horns of the fourth beast of Daniel 7. Remember, in chapter 7 of Daniel, he had this dream of four beasts rising up out of the sea. What was the kind of first beast that rose up? Anybody know this morning? What was the first beast that rose up?
I believe it was a lion with wings.
It was a lion, but he didn't have any wings. What was the second beast that rose up? Anybody know the second beast? Yes.
A bear.
It was a bear. What was the third beast that rose up in the back row? The four-headed leopard with wings. And what was the fourth beast that rose up? The terrible, dreadful beast, the dread beast number 4 of Daniel 11, which picture is on the screen. Someone asked why a triceratops was kind of chosen as the model for this. I think it works, and could have been a T-Rex, could have been a raptor, but I think the triceratops fits pretty well. And what I want to do here in this particular class is just go back and dig a little deeper into the 10 horns in terms of how we interpret them historically with the empires that come out of the fourth beast. Now remember, we identified the fourth beast as the Roman Empire. All right, the first one, the lion, was Babylon, the bear was Persia, the leopard was Greece. Now the fourth one, we identify it as Roman, and I went into some of the reasons why that fits. Basically, as critics try to cast Rome out of the picture, saying that it couldn't be something in Daniel interpreted from his period of time, 400 or 500 years into the future, and then they try to divide the Medo-Persian into two empires, then make the Greece Empire the fourth. That's typically the critical approach. And that lines up with the idea that Daniel was actually written in the 2nd century BC during the time of the Greek Empire by a Jew living in Jerusalem likely, but who was under the Greek Empire at that time. That critical analysis doesn't really stand up to so much of the analysis of the text, the history, and everything else. Daniel was written by Daniel in Babylon in the 6th century BC by the man who says that he was, and through God's prophetic gift, he was able to see down through history to the time of the Roman Empire. And again, it comes down to the kind of a binary choice. Either God inspires the Bible and God knows the end from the beginning, and a prophetic timeline or prophetic pronouncements in Scripture are within God's power and purview, or it isn't. You believe the Bible, as we do, then we believe that God does know the end from the beginning, and He does guide the broad streams of history toward the fulfillment of His purpose, and He can foretell the rise of this fourth empire and know the region of the world out of which it would come for any number of reasons, primarily all held within the spirit realm. Keep in mind, and we will see this when we get into Daniel 10, that the headlines of history are really written in the spiritual realm, not in the pages of newspapers or in history books or through events of solely nations and people living at any given time. That is history, and it is, yes, written by people and events, but the Bible shows us that the real headlines are written, if you will, in heaven or in the spiritual realm. And Satan has his plan, seeking to thwart the plan of God. God's plan continues to march forward, and we'll see that there are spiritual forces behind the scenes at work. And so God knows and is controlling ultimately the outcome of human history and the events. And so with that background, plus a knowledge of what history we can glean from the prophetic writings that match up, I think we are in safe ground to say that Rome is this fourth beast of the empire. Now, we have 10 horns here, all right, on this beast. Now, let's do a little correlation here for a moment with what we've already studied. On the image of Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2, remember the stone cut without hands strikes the image where? Where does it strike the image? At the feet. And how many toes are on those 2 feet? 10. Very good. Everybody's got 10 toes, so we know it's 10 toes. All right, so we've got 10 toes. You've got this on your beast chart. So Daniel 2, for the folks at home, I'm just putting it this way, we have 10 toes. All right, here in Daniel 7, we have 10 horns. All right. Now, in Revelation 17, we haven't got there yet, but we're going to find a 7th head. And we're also going to find something referencing 10 kings. Now, if you look at your chart, you'll see these 10 kings are referenced back to these 10 toes. These 10 kings appear at the time just prior to Christ's coming, and so that helps us to correlate it to the 10 toes of Daniel 2, which is where the stone cut without hands strikes the image, becomes the kingdom that fills the whole earth, which we define as the kingdom of God. Very good. All right, so we know those 10 toes have to be concurrent with that. Now, again, we haven't studied this yet, but what I'm showing you here is we've got 10 toes, 10 horns, and a 7th head that we haven't discussed yet. All that are representing Rome. Okay? And these 10 horns are on the 4th beast. Trying to kind of correlate it, hopefully kind of bring it all together in our minds so that we understand this. And this is kind of what we are looking at. We're dealing with a system that is Rome and the Roman Empire here. And so let's look at this. In the last class, we talked about the first 3 of the horns and the horn that comes up before them. Those 3 horns representing 3 Germanic kingdoms, the Vandals. I'm just going to put the V for the Vandals, H for the Heruli, and O for the Ostrogoths, which means Eastern goths. Ostro means Eastern. They were 3 Germanic tribes. I called them affectionately biker gangs that come roaring out of the northern reaches of what we would look at Europe and even the Asian steppes over here, and they eventually come down into Rome. Remember in our class on the Trinity discussion here recently, we talked about the Battle of Adrianople in what did I say, 375, 376, where the Eastern Emperor was killed, a legion was wiped out, and that was a critical part of the story of the ascendancy of the Trinitarian teaching of the church at that time, as opposed to the Arian teaching of that time. So I mentioned Arian because I want to bring this back. These 3 Gothic tribes who represent these first 3 horns that impact Rome after the collapse of the city in the year 476 BC, there's an interesting feature about these 3 tribes. They are somewhat Christian. Let's look at it. Let's call it that way. They have in these years they have been evangelized by the church of what is the Catholic Church, and they are Christian. But guess what? They're not Orthodox Christian. They're not Trinitarian Christian. They are Arian Christian, in that they believe Jesus was of the created order. And again, going back to our study, we showed how the development of the Trinity teaching in the 4th century BC, or I'm sorry, 4th century AD, was spurred by the Arian heresy that developed, wherein Jesus was looked upon merely as part of the created order. And so these three horns, these Germanic tribes, they're Christian somewhat, but they are Arian. Now this sets up a conflict with that little horn that we are looking at on the fourth beast that we identify as the papacy here in chapter 7. And here's why this is important. Because they're uprooted, they're plucked up. The story in history is this. By this time, in the late 5th century, 476 on into the 500 BC to 600 AD. I've got it wrong here. It is 476 AD for the fall of Rome. Forgive me for that. The church at Rome, the Catholic Church, with the papacy identified as this little horn of chapter 7, who speaks great things, seeks to change times and seasons we talked about. The papacy is not Arian. The papacy, the Pope, and let's say the larger Orthodox Church that now has had a power of the state working with it to enforce Orthodox teaching, they don't like these tribes. They see them as hostile in many ways, and one of which, a very important one, is that they are Arian Christians, which means they really are not Christians. And so, let's just go ahead and call him the Pope, seeks the help of the Eastern Empire, which is headquartered at Constantinople, to uproot these. And so the uprooting that Daniel 7 talks about, it does take place with the involvement of the papacy and the church, which, as remember, as we talked about the Arian Trinitarian controversy, we talked about beginning with, let's say, the Council of Constantinople and its edicts in 381 AD, and the clampdown of Orthodox teaching of Trinitarianism and other teachings that became entrenched within Catholicism. They have the state behind them to make this happen. And this is important to understand because we are seeing that there is enough development of the Catholic Church and the power of a pontiff, the Pope, to at least through politics and engagement with the state power of the empire to work together to enforce their change of seasons and times and to make war on the saints. And this is an important thing to realize because one of the knocks about the prophetic scenario that we have in the church of Daniel 7 and Revelation and identifying these horns particularly with Gothic or Germanic kingdoms, and then as we're going to see other powers here, is that the papacy didn't have enough development or power at that time. I think that's a false assumption and reflects a lack of understanding of what really is taking place in history and the facts of history. As I told you, the church and state came together to enforce Trinitarian teaching after 381 and the Council of Constantinople. And that only grew. And even with the collapse of the city of Rome in the West, and the problems that created, there was still the Eastern Emperor and the empire here. And as history tells us, this Pope over here did enlist the aid of the Eastern Emperor, and it kind of culminated in the one we're going to look at next, Justinian, in coming into this area and pushing out the power and defeating these Germanic tribes and reinstituting, let's say, Roman rule for a period of time with the church. And that happened. Now, there were a lot of other things taking place. part of which I'm going to save for our discussion in Revelation 13 about the development of the papacy and the Catholic Church after the collapse of Rome in 476 AD, and what that prophecy could tell us about that. But what happened with Rome is described in Revelation 13 as a deadly wound. But Revelation 13 says that it is healed. Now, this healing process really comes to light with the fourth horn of this beast of Daniel 7, which is a revival, a reclamation of, let's say, Western Imperial territory going down into northern Africa and over into Italy by the Emperor Justinian, living and ruling out of Constantinople in the 600s. Justinian brings about a restoration of the empire. It is called an imperial restoration. The story is briefly told in the booklet on the final superpower that you have as well. Justinian was a very interesting emperor in the story, but we identify him as this fourth horn. So we've moved beyond the three Germanic kingdoms and represented by the three horns when we come to the time of Justinian and his involvement with the restoration. Now, Justinian was a very capable and effective ruler. He had a large army. He had a very good general that he sent with the troops into this region to reclaim for the Imperium of Rome authority and control over this area. He was Catholic. He was in league with and certainly in sympathy with the Pope at Rome, and he effected a major change. Revelation 13 talks about the deadly wound of the one head, and we'll discuss that at that time. But that wound being healed is, I think, rightly attributed to what Justinian did effectively during that time from a historical perspective. Now, keep in mind, as we talk about these events and we seek to put a historical correlation to a prophetic statement, being plucked up by the roots, or a deadly wound, or a healing of that wound. In the prophetic stories, and we will see this in chapter 7 and again in chapter 8 with our discussion of another ruler, there's a type and antitype. What happened in history is something that is a foreshadowing of what is going to happen at the time of the end, especially as well. And there's always this tension that is taking place in the political religious realm throughout the story of Rome and its various revivals. And conflict, disagreement. Revelation chapter 17 speaks of this woman who rides the beast, this harlot, having committed fornication with the kings of the earth. And the use of that sexual term, fornication, is deliberate and should be understood as deliberate, because fornication is basically describing sexual relations between two unmarried people without a commitment of marriage. If we call it adultery, if that happens between two married people. If it happens outside of marriage, essentially fornication covers that. And what we're looking at is a political religious fornication, in that there's relationship between these political and religious powers, but it's unstable. It doesn't always last. It's based on power, money, prestige, everything except righteousness. Now, there's the guise of religion and holiness with the Pope and the saints and everything else, but it's a false religion. And that's why it's called a system of a harlot in Revelation 17. It is not true to God. It is not a true wife. God always describes the church, and we'll see that especially in Revelation, in terms of a committed relationship of a husband and wife. But the false church is portrayed as a harlot, trading her favors for power, for money, for lands and prestige and everything else. And Justinian comes into that as we see this fourth horn and looking at history. Now, one other thing I should note as we look at this image here of this beast, and we again describe it as Rome, there's only one empire in history that has had multiple revivals, a collapse and then a revival. And so to look at this system that comprises 10 horns or 10 powers, 10 collapses, let's say 9 collapses and then a 10th revival. Every time the Roman system, in a sense, went into an eclipse or time and circumstances caused a fading of glory as we look at history and power, it rises again. It rises again. We don't see that in the East with the Eastern capital and the Eastern Empire. As I've said before, Constantinople, later called Byzantium, exists for another nearly 1,000 years after 476 when Rome falls. And it eventually falls in the year 1453 AD to the Muslim armies of Islam. And to this day is still under Islamic control. There's never been collapse and revival. We see that in the West with what happens after the fall of Rome through history as the story flows up into Europe with European nations. And so when we look at 10 horns and we apply that to the Western Empire, historically we're on sound ground because that's the only empire, if you will, the Western Empire, that ever happened. And this is something that I've found admitted and understood even by modern writers. One of the things that I've done through the years as I've studied prophetic teaching I read a lot of history. I wish I could read 3 times more than I have read, but I've read a lot. And I like to read history that kind of helps to bring out the biblical story, the biblical record, and the prophetic record. And as I've sought to understand these prophecies and have had to deal with challenges to them, different interpretations that come from without and within the church through the years, I have gone to the history books. Well, are we right? Or are we wrong? And if we're right, why are we right? Is it just because we say we're right? That's not good enough. And to the degree we can, we should be able to match up a prophetic story and record with history and the facts of history. And that's why I always say, as we look at what we have, I think we're right. And, it's more than I think. I know we're right, but I'll say, okay, I'll think, we're right, but I don't think, but I know so. Just leave it at that. I read a book a few years ago by a European Jew. His name is Bernard Henri Lévy. Don't worry about that. But he wrote a book, a very short book. He's an intellectual, and he's been interested in the Kurdish peoples of Syria and the atrocities that have been committed against them by Turkey and the own Syrian people in the last decade or so. And he wrote a book about the conflict. And he basically, through the book, was basically saying somebody's got to come to the rescue of these peoples. And as he looked at world powers, he says, America should be able to do it, but they've turned their back on these Kurdish peoples. And his book, in a sense, turns to become an appeal to Europe to rise again. And he actually quotes the book of Daniel. He quotes other legends, Jewish traditions about Rome and its collapse and revivals, and that before the coming of the Messiah, certain rabbinic teachings had that Rome would rise again. And I'm reading this book and I'm realizing this guy is just basically saying what we have taught, but from his own intellectual readings and study. And his conclusion, I'll bring these out. Forgot to bring it in this morning, but probably when we come back to it in Revelation 13, 17, I'll bring them in. He basically says that Rome or Europe is going to rise again. And he, in a sense, he kind of begs for that to happen, seeing that that's the only one that can do it. In other words, impose a peace upon the world. And he makes the statement that when you look at all the world history, all world empires, the only empire, when it collapsed, within its ashes were the seeds of its revival. All right? That's a very important thought. In its ashes of collapse, there were the seeds of its revival. And he is talking about Europe. He's talking about Europe. And this story that we actually trace with these horns on this beast. And since we've come to this fourth one, let's go ahead and move on to the next one. We'll come back to Justinian in Revelation. He does have some fascinating other features to look at. The fifth horn of Daniel 7 we identify with the kingdom of a European king called Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, if you want to be technical. He is called the first Holy Roman Emperor, and that's a phrase you should know. Holy Roman Emperor from history. He becomes the first in a long line. Now, Justinian was a Roman emperor, but they don't typically call him of the Holy Roman Emperor, because the Holy Roman Empire largely is centered in Europe, not the east like at Constantinople. And so Charlemagne becomes the first Roman emperor. He is actually crowned that by the Pope in Rome on Christmas Day in the year 800. His story is a fascinating one as well. And so we look at him as the fifth horn, but perhaps the second revival of the empire, the first being with Justinian, and Charlemagne, who's crowned by the Pope. The Pope's name was Leo III. And Leo III was under a great deal of stress down in Rome because of warring factions with some of the other nobles and contending potentates of the time. And Charlemagne lives up in what is today France. He has his capital at a place called Aachen in Germany. I've been there a couple of times and been in his church that he built. It's still there. It's a fascinating place. There's a large town hall on the site where his palace was. Right next to it, he built his own church, and that's still there. And in Aachen, in Germany, it's in the western fringe of Germany. And Charlemagne had his capital there, and he was a warrior, but he was Christian, and he was warring for the church. I mean, there's a story about him that when he warred against the other Germanic tribes that were still restless up there in that part of Europe, he would demand they be baptized. If his army defeated them, then the survivors, they had to be baptized or face the sword. And so what would you do? Well, they got baptized. There's one story, he did that. He defeated one army, got them baptized, and then he heard the word came that there was another army of Germans that were upset and they were warring. And so he takes his army and up and moves them on a forced march. And because this other army, Germanic army, will not submit to Christianity, he kills them all. And he's a Christian king. All right, so there's a disconnect there. But he really hits payday when he goes down into Italy to Rome to help the Pope kind of solidify his authority. And on Christmas Day in 800, the Pope puts a crown on his head, crowns him as the leader of the Roman Empire. And so it is looked upon as a revival of this with the Pope and now this Frankish, French or German king, depends on, they all claim him up there. Charlemagne is big in the story. He is big. There's a magazine that is a weekly magazine today that is still put out called The Economist. I currently have a subscription to it. It's based in London, and it's really a very good magazine for covering world news. But they have a column every week that runs in The Economist, and the column is called Charlemagne. Charlemagne. And the column focuses essentially on what's happening in Europe, events, politics, culture in Europe. And it pays homage to the stature of Charlemagne in history. To this day, every year in Aachen, in Germany, they give the European Union gives what they call the Charlemagne Prize to the individual in that year who has done the most to advance the cause of Europe. It's called the Charlemagne Prize. So when I say he's big, his legend, his power, his influence, in a sense, he gives a name to this idea of Europe. And all of this gets back to an idea that you need to understand, and where we're going with this, that Europe matters. All right? I would put in there perhaps why Europe matters. Why does Europe matter? It matters because it is a part of the prophetic story and understanding we have from the Bible of a power that will arise, that has arisen, that has influenced the world, that has been prophesied by the prophet Daniel, and whose influence spreads through the ages until the time of the end, and in its final fulfillment will be centered or involve Europe, but be a final system called Babylon that will impact the entire world. Now, Charlemagne kind of sets the stage for that, but he was not the only one. Charlemagne's children didn't do as well as he did, and in a few years, his kingdom kind of divided and collapsed. And it was not until a couple, 300 years later that a man comes along called Otto the Great, who himself becomes the Holy Roman Emperor. This is about the mid-900s AD, when Otto the Great, a German king, assumes to the role through the election and through the accumulation of power, and he becomes then the new emperor of a German nation, but then he takes the title of a Holy Roman Emperor. And we look at him as the sixth horn here. He too was coronated by the Pope, and giving him that authority to kind of unite church and state during that particular period of time. But after him, it kind of waned again, and the empires and Europe kind of broke up into different kingdoms and factions. And it was not until a few years later that the family of the Habsburgs out of Austria rise to a power and become what we look in history having enough power to be labeled as another revival and the seventh horn. And particularly one king, Charles V, epitomizes this breadth of this Habsburg Empire that begins sometime in the 1200s and continues to grow and develop into the late 1700s when it is eclipsed by the eighth horn. But before then, they reached quite a large extent of land holdings and power and influence. And Charles V, who was actually of Spanish descent, probably is the biggest and greatest of those kings. The breadth of the Habsburg Empire during these years, and what we would call the seventh horn, was quite large. It not only was in Europe, but it was in South America and, believe it or not, North America. If you know your American history or a bit of your history from our country here, Spain settled the American Southwest, comprising today the states of, well, Texas. Remember the Alamo? You've heard the story of the Alamo. That involved the Spanish or Mexican troops who were, a remnant of that empire. New Mexico, Arizona, and California. When you look through all those parts of the country, you see Spanish names: San Francisco, San Diego, Los Angeles, the city of angels. You see the influence of the Spanish holdings that stretch that far. If we say that that empire was the seventh horn of this fourth beast, or a beast, then what we have to say is that parts of America at one time were under the control of the beast. During that time of the Spanish Empire, the Habsburg Empire, at its height. Anybody here born in California? Lived in California? You were born or lived there? You lived there. Well, I lived there for a short time myself, but those were territories owned by the beast, if you will. Now, history caused them to lose all of that. Eventually, America took control of that, which is all a part of the story as well. But the seventh horn we look at is Charles V. The eighth horn, then, that succeeds that is that of Napoleon, the famous French emperor. He was not really French, he was Corsican, one of the more famous figures in history. But he led a revival of a very large empire. And the histories tell us that Napoleon dreamt of reviving and even rivaling the empire of Charlemagne and throughout Western Europe, and to, in a sense, recapture the glory of Rome. And Napoleon sought to do that. He wound up down in Egypt with French troops. He conquered Italy and much of Europe during his brief time and stint as the emperor of the French. It's a fascinating story, but he looked to Rome and Christendom for inspiration, and he then ultimately was crowned by the Pope as a Holy Roman Emperor. Just last year, a new movie came out about Napoleon, and it's one you might want to see sometime. It's not historically correct. They take some liberties with certain historical events, and some have squabbled about the portrayal by the actor of Napoleon. But it's interesting, and at least you see the power that he did hold. But his empire came to a collapse in 1814. He met, as they say, his Waterloo when the Allied armies finally got enough together to defeat him finally and sent him off into exile. But he was on a rampage to conquer Europe, all of Europe, and extend himself. He invaded Russia and got bogged down there. Anyone who has invaded Russia usually loses. That's part of the story of history. But Napoleon we look at as this eighth horn. The ninth horn is that of the World War II armies and powers of Adolf Hitler in Germany and Benito Mussolini in Italy. The ninth horn here. This comes about after a revival of Germany in the late 1800s and into the early 1900s, precipitating even World War I, where Germany and the powers aligned with it were defeated. But then just a few years later, they rearm under Hitler, and we have World War II take place. And we look at this as the ninth horn and a revival of a European-based power that had large aspirations to conquer the world. Now, in our time and place, we are obsessed with stories about Nazi Germany, Hitler, World War II. Even though World War II has been over for more than 70 years, Books are still being written, movies are still being made, analysis and are still being made of all of that period of time and what happened and the impact. Our world today still is impacted by what happened during the time of the revival of this ninth horn under these European powers, along with the power of Japan that joined in with them for a time and created literally a world war wherein millions and millions of people were killed and the whole world order was turned upside down. And as I say, we're still being impacted by that. And so this is the ninth horn. The 10th horn is yet to appear. The 10th horn is that of again, a power centered in Europe, which is why in the church and in our approach to understanding the politics of the world today and history and seeking to be watchful and mindful about events leading up to these prophetic fulfillments, we watch Europe. And we always have in the church. As I came into the church in the early 1960s, I got a crash course in European geopolitics. And of course, that wasn't hard to get because the world was still recovering from World War II at that time. My father was a World War II veteran. And it was fresh in mind, at least in his mind, and I heard the stories. I wasn't alive at that time, but I heard the stories. And in the church, we have been watching events there. We seek to try to understand the entire world as well, but we have had a focus upon Europe. And through the years, in recent years especially, with Europe going through all kinds of evolution, attempts to unite the European Union, that as it is currently called, with more than 20 countries a part of this union, we have, you watch Europe, and Europe today is a power, but it is nowhere near the power that could effect what is described by this 10th horn and this entire system that we'll develop more when we get into the book of Revelation. Does that mean that Europe could not fulfill the role that is described here in Revelation 17, where a woman rides a multi-headed beast, that we will define again as this revival of this final 10th horn and a final revival of this system that is kind of centered in Rome? Does that mean that it will not happen there? Well, we need to be very careful that we don't just go off the deep end and say, well, Europe's a sick man, they don't have the power, they have the squabblings and this and that. The spiritual power that we are describing of this beast and the spiritual mind that is behind it, which is satanic, doesn't slumber, doesn't sleep. And what is described here in biblical prophecy will happen. As we study the Bible and we seek to understand from history how this can happen, there is no other power or empire that's ever existed other than what has been in Europe with various revivals and permutations that can come about and rise and be a part at the heart and at the center. And I use my words carefully there, at the heart and the center of a global system that the Bible calls Babylon. This 10th horn, which we'll study in more detail in Revelation, is called Babylon the Great Mystery Religion. And it's a combination of church and state, but it's a global enterprise. It's a global empire. And it's far more than Europe. It has to be by what is described in the Bible. We'll talk about that later. But I just want to make this final point here so that we understand that Babylon of the time of the end, this 10th horn that waits to be revived, is a global system that's going to look pretty good. It's going to look pretty good. Now, the Bible describes it as a power that is satanic, and there's a lot of evil there, but believe me, people are going to welcome its appearance. Why? Because they will restore order. They will restore order. I'm going to put that word on the board here, and I'm going to take you back to what we've already talked about with Rome and Augustus. What do we call the system under which Jesus was born and the church began in the Roman Empire? What is that called? The Pax Romana. That means peace, not war. What does peace bring? Good things. Peace brings the ability to start a business, earn an income, build a home, raise a family, live a peaceful life, go to Disney World. Really. You have to think in those terms. And what the Bible describes is a system that's going to appear at a time of crisis that will save the bank accounts, your debit cards, your ability to put the card into the gas pump and pump your car full of gas and buy groceries at the grocery store. It's going to be a system that people are going to welcome. And it will be global, and it will be lucrative, and it will be powerful. It will also be deceptive. But more of that to come. Those are the 10 horns of Daniel 7. And the 10th horn correlates to these toes and these 10 kings over here in Revelation 17. So we'll take a break at this point, and then with our next class we will get into chapter 8 of the book of Daniel.